And now we're on Daf Chaf Hey Amid Beis. And we are trying now to determine whether they did the second pious in 13 different separate lotteries or one lottery. Toshma, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, we have the following brisa that records the statement of Rabbi Yehuda, Lo haya pious lemachta. The Ketores had two parts to it. One part was to bring the Ketores into the Heichal and to place it down on the machta, on the pan of Gecholim. The other part, the other responsibility, was for a different Kohen to collect the Gecholim, the hot coals from the Mizbeach, in a machta, and bring that machta into the Heichal so that the Kohen who did the Haktorah would now have Gecholim, and he would pour the Ketores onto these Gecholim. Says Rabbi Yehuda, El Kohen shezacha b'Ketores omer lezeh imo zechei imi b'machta. It means that there was only one pious for the Ketores, which means the burning of the Ketores, and this Kohen, we'll call him Arola, he turns to another Kohen and he tells him that you're in charge of carrying the machta. You'll bring the pan full of gecholim into the heichal. I'll do the aktoris. And it's really fascinating that the halacha, the underlying logic of this halacha is that really the person, the avoda of bringing the machta in, it's a secondary kind of avoda. It's just almost a hechsher mitzvah. The real mitzvah is the haktorah. So the balabas, as we'd say in Yiddish, on this haktorah was the one going to zoch in the haktorah, and therefore he's going to determine who is the kohen who brings in the machta into the heichal. Now, Rashi seems to indicate that on the one end, the Kohen who is Zocha and the pious for the Ketores, that's going to be the next pious in the next Mishnah, he is not going to just choose arbitrarily, his favorite buddy Kohen to bring the Machta with the Cholim into the Heichal, but rather he turns to his right, the Kohen immediately standing on his right in the pious. However, Tosfos does indicate that if the first Kohen who won the pious decides for whatever reason that he doesn't want to give the privilege of bringing the Machta into the Torah, into the Heichal, to this Kohen on his right, he has veto power. So he is a certain sense of balabas. So the Gemara says that we see that you can give out two tasks, two avodos, with one single pious. Mamina. Therefore, we should learn that in the second pious, there was one Kohen who was Zocha, and then he turned to his right, and so forth and so on, and 13 Kohanim were all included in that one pious. Or says that's not true. Shiny machto ktoris the chada avodi. Oh, no. The reason there's only one single pious, Rabbi Yehuda teaches us, in the case of a ktoris, even though there are two jobs, shnei tafkidim, is because it's all one avoda. I just need someone to bring the gecholim with the machta into the Eichel so that I can burn the Ketores on the Machta, but it's all one avoda. And truth be told, we now begin to understand why Rabbi Yehuda made this comment in the context of the Ketores. He didn't make this in the context of our Mishnah with regard to the avodas of the Talmud, etc. Ika di Amri. Others present the proof from the Brisa of Rabbi Yehuda, Dafka Machto Ketores, Rabbi Yehuda only allowed one pious for two tasks in the specific exceptional case of the Torres, the Chad Avodah. It's all one avoda. Aval shara avodos, boy pious. In the case of all the other avodos, each one is an independent avoda. It's not one single avoda. And since several avodos are involved, we need a separate pious for each one of the avodos. Now the Gemara says, according to the Ika Diamri, I'm going to reject your proof. It could be that Rabbi Yehuda would have a single pious for all the different tasks of the Avodas HaTamid that are included in the second pious. The only reason he mentioned this specifically in the case of the Torres is machta itztrich lesalke daitachamina oivolo shchicha uma'atra naskin le pious bifnei atzma kamash. Interesting. The Gemara says that there was a specific havamina why we would need two paisos for the Ketores. The Ketores has what I would call a special skula. That's why there are many people who read the Parsha of the Ketores on a daily basis. And that skula is called Shchicha Uma'atra. Ma'atra means riches. You know, you want to get wealthy, get yourself involved in the Avodas HaKetores. And we'll see later on, tomorrow's Daf Chavav Mirz Hashem at 10:45. We'll see that the Gemara derives this from a pasuk that anyone who's involved in the Avodas HaKetores is blessed with Ashirus. So therefore, everybody wants to get a part of this Avodah, and let's see if we could, divvy up the wealth. Let's make a separate pious for one, and that's the Aktor itself, a second pious for the Machta. Mashmalan, that's why Rabbi Yehuda went out of his way to tell us that since it's all one avoda, one pious is enough. But he had a compelling reason to explain that in this case of the Torah, one pious is enough. But in truth, Rabbi Yehuda would hold perhaps that one pious is enough for all the avodos mentioned here in our Mishnah, the avodah, the pious Hashem. Toshma. But now we have a very conclusive, explicit brisa. Tani Rabbi Chia, lo lechol avodah v'avodah mefaisim. They didn't separate each avodah independently with its own pious. Ella kohen shezacha b'tamid, which means that he was zocha to the shchita of the tamid. He was the first one online for when the memuna counted his number 60, whatever number he had in mind. Yishnei masar echva kohanim shachim imo. Then each one of the other Kohanim, there are another 12 on the list, would also be Zocher together with him, and they would turn to the Kohen on his right, and he would get the second one, the Zrika, and then the one on the right, and he would take the Avarim up to Tommy, up to Kevesh, and so forth and so on. Shmami, no, we see clearly that we only had to designate through this lottery one particular Kohen for one particular Avodah, and then we would know automatically. Now, in a certain sense, that takes the chashivus away from all these avodos that they don't deserve their own pious. In fact, the Gemara had a havmi that in Ketores, in order to respect the chashivus of the machta, we should have a separate pious for the machta. Now, the Mishnah says pious hasheni. There is no mention, as we emphasized when we read the Mishnah, of the Kabbalah and the Holacha. Iboilahu. Mimakabel, apparently, Kabbalah and Holacha falls between the first Kohen who got the privilege of Shchita and the second who had the privilege of Zrika. One of those two Kohen, and we don't know which, is Zoche in Kabbalah and Holacha. And you and I would have said logically that it's the Kohen Hazorik. Why? Because Holachas Adam and even Kabbalas Adam are all part and parcel of the culmination of Avodah, which is Zrikas Adam. And the Gemara says the following: De'i Amrit Zorek Mekabel. If you're going to say that the Zorek was the one who was privileged to have not only the Zrika, but also the Kabbalah Saddam, is, you know what? Agav chavivut say lo makabel lekule adam. We're going to learn later on that the Gemara is going to derive from a pasuk that the mitzvah is to collect all the dam that comes out of the tzavar of the animal, the zevach after shchita. But this Kohen is so preoccupied and so eager to do the zrika, he might be tempted, if he's also charged with the duty of Kabbalah, to be makabel only that minimum amount of dam that he needs in the Mizrach in order to implement the zrika. But he's not going to be interested in taking his time slowly and methodically of guaranteeing that he's makabel all the dam. So therefore, it makes sense that it's the shochet who doesn't have that responsibility of zrika will give him the duty of Kabbalah Saddam. And we can rely on him to be makabel all the time. Oh, Dilma, what's the other side of the Gemara Safek? Zorek makabel. Why do we want to exclude the shochet from Kabbalah? I'll tell you why. Dimamet shochel makabel zidin to shochet zar. The halacha is that shchita is ksheira bizar. So you can't award the first pious to include the Kabbalah Saddam. Kabbalah Saddam requires a Kohen. And we might be doing a pious in which a non-Kohen could win the lottery as far as Shechita, because we don't need a Kohen for Shechita. Now you're going to tell me that he's going to do the Kabbalah? Impossible. So since in that scenario where it was the Zar who did the Shechita, it's impossible to say that he's in charge of the Kabbalah. That just won't fly. Therefore, we assume that as a general rule, the Kabbalah was awarded to the Zorek, who has to be, of course, a Kohen. Toshma. Let's quote a brisa and see if we can come to some definite conclusion. Ben Katan, one of the great Kohanim Gedolim, asa shnemasar dad lakiyar kidei shiyu shnemasar echav hakohanim haoskim b'tamid mekadshim yodeim v'ragleim b'vasachas. This great contribution of adding an extra faucets to the kiyar in order to facilitate the ability for all the Kohanim who is zocher in the avodas hatamid to do what's called kiddush yadayim raglayim. They didn't have to wait on a queue online, till they got, there was the last guy in the line. They didn't have to do so. Why? Because this man, by the name of Ben Kotim, he provided for a kiyar that has as many as 12 faucets in order to expedite the kiddush yadayim v'raglayim of all the Kohanim who were involved in the services. So he added, in effect, 12 faucets to the kiyar that had one faucet. Truth is, later on we'll learn in the Mishnah, I'm almost up to that in my later shia during the day, that there were 2 spouts initially to the kiyar, so that Ben Kotin added another 10. But anyway, the magic number here is 12. Now, wait a second. We were divvying up the avoda. Isal Kedaktik Shochet Mekabel. Now, the Shochet, who is not involved in an avoda, or rayat's ksheira bizar, he doesn't need kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. So we're not going to add a spout for him. However, if we assume, just 1 second, let's work it. Now we have a problem. Why? Because if we assume that the winner of the first prize, meaning the Shechita pious, is now going to do the Kabbalah, then we have to add a 13th spout. We didn't need a spout for the Shochet because Shechita is not an avodah, it's ksheira bizar. He doesn't need kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. But certainly for Kabbalah Saddam, we need kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. Says the Gemara, Tleis Haravi. He should have given us 13 spouse. Elalav shmamina zorek mekabel. We already have a spout and a kiddush yadayim raglayim for the zorek. That covers us as far as Kabbalah Saddam, because that Kohen will be zocher in the avod of Kabbalah Saddam. Beautiful. Amalei Rav Acha Breder Rav Ashi Afanana Mitnina will support this conclusion from a Mishnah in Masechet Tamid. Shachad HaShochet v'kibel hamakabel ubalo lizrak. So you see that there's a shochet, and then there's a makabel, and the makabel comes to be zorek. I mean, it's the same person who did both the Kabbalah and the Zrika Shmamina. And now we're going to get into this very technical, multi machlokas with so many different shittas about exactly what the sequence was of bringing the various parts of the animal up the kevesh for the purpose of aktor al gabi mizbeh. We learned in a brisa, and now we have the first opinion of the brisa. Now, it seems, if I'm not mistaken, I'll correct myself if I'm wrong, that the first opinion in this brisa is that of Ben Azai. So let's go back and read Ben Azai. Hilucho, derech hilucho hoya korif. That was Ben Azai in our Mishnah on Daf Chafei Amid Aleph. So what we're talking about, according to Ben Azai, is derech hilucho, which means that we carry up the parts of the animal in the order that you would see an animal walking, derech hilucho, from head to tail. And what does that mean? Number one, harash veharegel. Now again, the regel is really last when the animal walks, because we're talking about the right hind leg. But nevertheless, as we said before, for a specific reason, they had to bring that along together with the head. And then when an animal walks, after the rush goes first, the head of the animal, then hachaze v'agera. And then we have the breast and the neck. And then, right, so the animal, the head, and then we have the neck, and then we have the breast, and after the breast of the animal comes the forelegs, and that's called shtei yadayim. And then we have shtei dfanos, right? Those are the shoulders of the animal, and ha'oketz ve'aregel, and we're left with the tail and the back leg. Again, we would have had two legs in the back, but as we said, we need one leg to cover the mokum shchit. So that reflects the shita of Ben Azai, kederech hilucho, as an animal would walk if it was alive. Rabbi Yossi Omer, he has a different shita. Please, let's not confuse this Rabbi Yossi with Rabbi Yossi Haglili, who's going to appear as another shita in this long brisa. So what's Rabbi Yossi's? Derech hefshet hoyakorif. Right, there's halacha requiring hefshet, that the carbon has to be skinned, flayed. We have to take off the hides. Eitzad, derech hefshet. What is the sequence? Harash v'regel. Okay, everybody agrees that the rush is most important, and therefore it has to come first on the mizbeach. Ha'oketz v'regel. Now, the way they tanned or flayed the animal, I should say, hefshet, was they went to the tail and the left leg on the back. Then they did shtei fanos. See, what's happening here is that's where we're missing one piece of the puzzle. The hefshet was done after the shchita and the zrika, etc. They hung up the carbon on like a hook, and by hooking it up, when they got to the hefshet, and the hefshet was facilitated by the fact that the animal was sort of suspended, So they started from the back of the animal, which is the tail, and then they got to the back leg of the animal, then forward, moving forward to the main body, the phanos, the flanks of the animal, and then shtei yadayim, the forelegs, until they finally got to the chazeh and the gera. And all this is kederech hefsheto. Then we have Rabbi Akiva's opinion that's codified here in this price. So derech nitucho hoyakore. Forget about hefshet. Let's talk about nituach. And by the way, I think in the past we've spoken about the fact that both hefshet and nituach can be done by a zar, a non-kohen. But anyway, we're up to nituach. And ketzad derech nitucho. How did they cut up the parts of the carbon? Harash v'regel. We always start with the rush and the regel. Then we go to the shtei yodayim. Those are the legs in front of the animal. And that's where we're going to cut them down. And then chazeh gera, and then shtei defanos, until we finally get to the oketz v'regel. Now we have Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Derech iluyo hayakar. This is a new take, a whole new philosophy here about what sequence we should bring the various parts onto the mizbeach, and it should be derech iluyov, which is more chashuv. Ketzad derech iluyah harash v'regel. First, the head is the most chashuv. Chazeh v'gera, right? The chazeh, I guess, represents the main part of the, of the animal. Shtei adfanos oketz v'regel u'shtei yadayim. Now, again, in our brisa, we have Rabbi Yossi on top, who says derech hefsheto. And in derech hefsheto, we have almost the exact opposite of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who says derech iluyo, in terms of the significance or the superior quality. So that when you talk about defanos, then according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, you'll see in his sequence that the defanos come before the regel. But that makes sense, that the defanos are more chashuv than the regel. So the Gemara asks, but there's a pasuk in Sefer Yechezkel that seems to indicate the opposite. The pasuk says, "Kol natach tov yorech v'kotev." Now the yorech, which is in English a thigh, comes here before the kotev. The kotev is the shoulder. So it sounds like Yechezkel Hanavi puts the thigh first and then the shoulder second, because the thigh has some sort of superior quality. Don't ask me why, but that's what it seems from Yechezkel Hanavi. And Rabbi Yossi had put the leg, right, the thigh, in front of the shoulders. And yet here the pasuk says Yerech first and Kotev second. The Gemara answers, Hahi Bikchusha. Okay, here we have what's called a lean animal. Now you have to keep in mind that Yechezkel, in his context, is castigating what was terrible decayed behavior, in which the thieves were stealing animals that belonged to the poor people. How much more repulsive can you get than that? And those animals that the poor people owned were lean, and they didn't have much meat to them. And therefore, in the case of a kusha, it's actually the thigh, the yerech, that has more meat to it than what normally, in the case of a fat animal, a healthy animal, would be the kotev, the shoulders. The shoulders are full of meat, but in a thin, lean animal, the portion that has the most meat is actually the thigh of the animal. But if you have a normal shaman, a fat animal, then the fattiest part, the choicest part, is not going to be the kotev. I'm sorry, not going to be the yerech, but rather the kotev. Omar Rava, Bein Tana Didanu, Bein Rabbi Yossi, Basri Luye de Pisras Linon. Now, in the light of what we discussed, we could say that all the Tanoim agree that the sequence is determined by quality, which is superior in quality. But Mar, Ozil Basar Ivra de Bisra, Umar Ozil Basar Shamna de Bisra. There are two parts to the meat of the animal. One is the meat itself, and the other is the fat. And the difference is going to be which has superior quality. Is it the amount of meat on the limb, or is the amount of fat on the limb? My taima salka regel bahadi resha. We saw over and over again that all the Tanaim agree that the right hind leg comes with the rush. Why is that? And the Gemara answers, Mishum Dereisha Nefisha Be Atzamos is Karva Regel Bahadeh. Because there's so many bones on the head, and it looks like we're giving the Mizbeach very little meat. Like, for example, if you've ever eaten, part of a sheep, you'll see it's mostly bone. Take a fish, the head is almost all bone. So therefore, karva regel behadeh, they want to bring the regel, which is full of meat, and that makes it more respectable for their head. The Kuli Alamias Rosh Kreva Beresha Minolan. Every single time in the Brisa agrees that the Rosh comes first. And how do we know this? The Sanya, what's the source in the Torah that the Rosh comes first? Minayin the Rosh upeder shekodmim l'chol haivarim. So we bring the heads and the fats of the animal first before all the other limbs, because of a pasuk in Sefer Vayikra, at the beginning of Vayikra, it says, Es harosh, es rosh of es pidro vi arach, and the rush is first. Now, at this point, again, we only have a minute or two left. I just want to open up a chumash here. So that we can see Perek Aleph of Sefer Vayikra, Pasuk Ches. It says, "The archu b'nei Aaron hakohen es hanesochiv, es harosh v'es hapodar, al ha'etzim asher al ha'esh," etc. So that's the pasuk that we quoted here. And then, if you fast forward to pasuk Yud Beis, the pasuk says in pasuk Yud Beis, "V'nitacho solon esachav esro shovies pidro." So why does the Torah repeat in pasuk Yud Beis pidro, which was already mentioned in an earlier pasuk Ches, ves hapoder? So the Gemara says, "Ve'idach peder achrina," the other mention of peder, the fats, and here we turn to Daf Chavav Haman Aleph. Lamaya, so what's the second one? Teaching L'chsanya, Kesad Haya Oseh, what did the Kohen do when he offered the head and the fat? No senes ha-peder ha-beis ha-shchita. Interesting. He would wrap around the fat to cover the neck, the Beis Hashchita, Maleu, and then he would burn it on the Mizbeach. V'zeu derech kavod shel mal. And this is a kavod in front of the Ribono Shel Olam that we shouldn't bring on the Mizbeach a piece of meat that's full of dam. So we sort of wrap it around with the fats and we cover that part of the as we end the shir, I just wanted to read one note here. And he says, Pasuk Ches, which again in the English translation, they shall arrange the pieces, the head and the fat on the wood that is on the fire on the altar. So the fat is included amongst the pieces that I mentioned earlier. Why does the Torah repeat itself and refer to it separately? And this verse mentions the head separately. However, that's necessary, as the Gemara explains in Masechet Chulin on Daf Chav Zayin, because earlier in Pasuk Vav, the Torah states, he shall skin the ola and cut it into pieces. And Pasuk Ches, they shall arrange the pieces on the altar. The implication is that the pieces mentioned in the latter verse, those that required arranging on the Mizbeach, are the same ones that are mentioned in the form of the earlier Pasuk Vav, meaning that the pieces that have already been skinned. The head, however, is not skinned because it is severed from the animal's body before the skinning begins. And since the head is not skinned, and since only skinned pieces are subject to arranging on the Mizbeach, one might have thought and concluded that the head should not be amongst those pieces that the Kohen arranges on the Mizbeach. So in order lafuke to dispel this notion, the Torah states in Pasuk Vav, they shall arrange the pieces, the head and the fat on the Mizbeach. The fat, on the other hand, is contained in the part of the animal that's skinned. And therefore the Gemara is bothered why the Pasuk has to again specify the fat. And the answer is because there's going to be a fat that comes together with the makom hashchita, the beis hashchita, zeu derech kavod shel mal. Mirza Hashem, tomorrow, Daf Chav Vav. Thank you and have a great day.